Hello, welcome to Lightning Round, a series where I try and explain DJ and production topics in as little time as possible without missing anything super important. This should be a pretty easy one, but it's something that I see a lot of questions about, so today we're going to go over the concepts of freezing and flattening. Freezing and flattening audio channels is a way to cleverly reduce the amount of work that your CPU has to do when it's rendering lots of audio channels at once. Your DAW has to calculate the audio coming from each channel, and then run it all through each audio effect individually, and then through the group audio effects, and then combine them all at the end, and then run them through the master channel effects, and then the audio gets to the speakers. And it has to do this 48,000 times per second for each sample if you're running at 48K samples. And that's extremely demanding on some computers, especially some older CPUs. It's a lot of math. So one way to know that your CPU isn't keeping up and you might need to use freezing and flattening is if you're having little gaps or clicks in the audio that aren't part of what the audio actually is if you solo the channel, but when you play the entire track, you end up with these little artifacts. If you are having the issue of some audio samples just not playing entirely, even though they're on the timeline, it's probably your hard drive that's slow, and I would move everything to an SSD, but that's a different conversation. Most of my experience comes from Ableton, and that's what I'm most familiar with, but some variation of freezing and flattening is possible in pretty much every major DAW. So if you are running into issues, you can freeze and flatten some of the more audio-intensive channels that have a lot of effects on them, and that can help free up some of your CPU to think about other stuff. So one example is I often will make these really big risers with a lot of different effects and stuff automating up and down to sort of build tension before a drop. I don't need to be rendering that every single time. It's going to sound the same every time, it's fine. So what I will do is once I get the riser sounding how I like it, I will freeze it, and basically what Ableton does is run through that channel once, figure out what it sounds like, and then save that audio as one big long sample, and then it will just play that back every time it needs to, instead of figuring out what it's going to sound like and running the audio through all of the effects every single time. Freezing is reversible. In Ableton and in everything else, the freezing equivalent is going to be reversible. So you can sort of make it, freeze it as a sample, even if you're going to work on it and tweak it more later, and then come back, unfreeze something, make some changes if you decided that you wanted something to sound different, and then refreeze it again to go work on other parts of the track. This is really helpful, especially if you have an older computer and you're starting to make more complicated tracks and you're finding that you're running into issues, but you don't have the money to necessarily upgrade your computer right now. It's also really useful when using things like Contact and Omnisphere. These can be very CPU-intensive programs, so if you throw those on and you find that you're getting issues, it's totally normal to just freeze that track and leave it be. What isn't reversible is flattening. So once you've frozen a track, you can then flatten it and replace your track with one long audio sample like we were talking about earlier with freezing, but this completely replaces the audio track that was there. So it's really helpful in some ways. You can do a lot of interesting audio manipulation that you can't quite do with MIDI, but it does have the detriment of you can't now go back and undo it. So what I will often do is if I'm gonna flatten something, I will make a duplicate and then flatten the duplicate and have that as raw audio and turn off all of the VSTs and everything, all of the effects on the MIDI channel. That way, if I really do want to go back and change something later, I can, but I can just work with the raw audio and not have to render that every single time. So that's helpful. You can also, it's quite similar to something called resampling, if you're familiar with resampling, but it's just a quick and easy way to basically resample one entire audio channel into raw audio. If you want to know more about this, feel free to ask me in the comments, because there are plenty of nuances and specific cases that change how freezing and flattening work, and side chaining and reverb and effect sends. But if I went into all of those, then this wouldn't be a lightning round video. Goodbye.